3 seconds. That's how long an American pilot had, on average, once a Japanese Zero settled onto his tail. Then the guns opened up, and another Wildcat went into the Pacific with a man still strapped inside it. By the winter of 1942, the United States Navy was sitting on a secret it badly did not want getting back home. Their best fighter plane couldn't win. It wasn't that the Wildcat was falling behind. Man for man, turn for turn, it lost to the Zero almost every time, and every pilot climbing into one already knew it before he took off. Then, on the morning of June 4, 1942, one squadron commander looked up and saw a sky gone completely black with enemy fighters. 50 of them, maybe more, closing in on 8 American planes. By any honest math, tactics, training, sheer numbers, those 8 men had no business coming home. They did anyway. And the reason wasn't a faster engine, or a hidden weapon, or blind luck. It traced back to 2 matchsticks, laid out on a kitchen table in San Diego, months earlier. This is how one man's 5-minute idea rewrote the rules of aerial combat, and how the Navy nearly filed it away before it got the chance to save 2,000 lives. To understand why 2 matchsticks mattered, you first have to understand exactly how badly American pilots were losing. On paper, the Mitsubishi Zero outclassed the F4F Wildcat in almost every way that mattered. It climbed faster. It outturned anything the Americans put in the air. And by early 1942, most of the men flying it already carried 2 years of real combat experience over China, pilots who had killed before and knew precisely how. Navy doctrine assumed fighters met one-on-one, spot the enemy, turn to engage, outfly him, win. It had held up fine for 20 years. Against the Zero, it fell apart in under 15 seconds. The time it took a Zero to work its way onto a Wildcat's tail, line up its guns, and end the fight before it had really started. Squadron after squadron ran the same playbook and watched it fail the same way, every time. So command's answer wasn't a new tactic. It was a warning, printed in every briefing. Avoid turning engagements, disengage if outnumbered. Reasonable on paper. In the cockpit, it amounted to run, and pray the man beside you can run too. By that February, the Pacific Fleet had already buried dozens of pilots who'd tried to outturn a Zero and lost. What the Navy needed was some way of turning a Wildcat's weakness into a strength. And the man who stumbled onto it wasn't a tactician or an engineer. He was a 37-year-old Lieutenant Commander named John Thach, alone in his quarters, staring at a box of matches his wife had mailed him. He'd been chewing on the problem for weeks, the way you worry a splinter you can't quite dig out. How do you beat a plane that's faster than yours, tighter turning than yours, and flown by someone with more hours in combat than you? That night, he pulled 2 matches from the box and set them side by side on the desk. Almost absently, he began sliding them toward each other, crossing, pulling apart, crossing back again. 2 bits of wood, braiding themselves together. Somewhere in that motion, an idea locked into place. What if a pair of Wildcats never fought as individuals at all? The moment a Zero committed to chasing one man, that pilot wouldn't try to shake him with a turn. He'd fly straight at his own wingman instead. The wingman banks toward him at the same moment. Their flight paths cross. And the Zero, still locked on his original target, ends up flying directly into a second Wildcat's guns. Speed stops being an advantage the second it becomes a leash, and that leash pulls the Zero right into the trap. Elegant, simple to draw on paper. And it broke a rule that had stood since the First World War. Fighters split apart when a fight started. Thach was proposing they do the exact opposite. Stay locked together, always. He called his wingman in that night, didn't say a word, just slid the matches back and forth across the desk. His wingman watched for a long moment. Then he asked the only question that mattered. When do we test it? The answer came days later, in the hardest classroom there is. Live combat, real Zeros, and other men's lives riding on whether Thach had gotten the math right. 6 enemy fighters dropped out of the sun toward 4 Wildcats flying in a loose line. A formation doctrine said should already be breaking apart into separate dogfights. It didn't break apart. Thach keyed his radio and gave an order no one had ever spoken in U.S. Navy combat before. Weave pattern. Execute. He banked toward his wingman. His wingman banked toward him. From 8,000 feet to a Japanese pilot, it must have looked like a mistake. 2 Americans about to collide and save everyone the trouble of a dogfight. They didn't collide. At the last instant, both men broke, one left, one right, passing with barely 200 feet between their wingtips, then curving back around to cross a second time. A figure 8, drawn at 300 miles an hour with live ammunition aboard. The lead Zero took the bait, locked onto the wingman, closed the distance with total confidence, exactly the way he'd been trained to. The wingman didn't try to shake him. He simply flew toward Thach. The Zero followed him straight into Thach's sights. The Japanese pilot broke hard and clawed for altitude, running. For the first time in the Pacific War, a Zero fled from a Wildcat. 6 minutes after it began, the fight was over. 4 Wildcats had gone up. All 4 landed. No one hurt. No one killed. Thach's hands were shaking when he climbed out of the cockpit. Not fear, but the dizzying weight of a single realization. Maybe his pilots didn't have to die every time a Zero showed up after all. He filed the report that same afternoon. What happened, why it worked, and a clear recommendation. Teach it to every fighter squadron in the Pacific, starting now. 3 days later, a reply landed on his desk. Interesting tactic. Requires further testing. Not approved for widespread use. Men were dying every week, and the official answer was, circle back later. So Thach stopped waiting for permission. For the next 4 months, he drilled his squadron on it constantly. Morning sorties, night formations, chalk diagrams for anyone who'd stand still long enough to look. Fly toward your partner. Cross, peel back, cross again. Easy enough on a blackboard. A different animal entirely, with cannon fire chewing up your wing while you're doing it. One squadron commander pulled him aside and told him flatly that flying straight at another aircraft mid-combat was a good way to trade 1 funeral for 2. Thach kept teaching regardless, because the doctrine already on the books was filling those funerals 1 Wildcat at a time, and at least his idea gave the men a fighting chance instead of an order to run. While he was still training pilots who technically weren't cleared to use what he was teaching them, Navy codebreakers were reading something far more pressing. Japan was massing 4 aircraft carriers and close to 300 planes for the largest carrier strike of the war so far, aimed at a speck of American territory called Midway. America could field 3 carriers to their 4, crewed by pilots with far less combat experience than the men flying against them. Within weeks, Thach's squadron would be aboard the USS Yorktown, headed straight into it. June 4, 1942, 9:30 in the morning, 14,000 feet above the Yorktown. Thach looked up and found the sky already full. Japanese dive bombers, with a fighter escort stacked above them. Not 50 Zeros as feared. 12, still 3-1 against his own 4 Wildcats. They dove exactly as trained, splitting the attack. 3 peeling toward Thach, 4 toward his wingman, Ensign Edward Bassett. Weave pattern. Execute. Mark. Thach cut hard toward Bassett. Bassett cut hard toward him. Their paths crossed at 12,000 feet, and the Zero chasing Thach suddenly found himself staring down Bassett's guns instead. He froze for half a second. At that speed, half a second is 400 yards of closing distance he wasn't getting back. Thach fired. The Zero's cowling tore open and it rolled away streaming black smoke. His first confirmed kill of the war. But the 2 remaining Zeros had learned something in the last 4 months too. Rather than both chase the same tail, they split. One climbing above, one diving below, leaving Thach to choose which threat to counter. For 6 seconds the weave came apart, and both Wildcats were suddenly fighting alone. The exact scenario the whole tactic existed to prevent. Cannon rounds raked across Thach's wing, 2 punched clean through it. A third tore through his canopy, missing his skull by 3 inches. "I'm hit! Repeat! I'm hit!" Bassett's plane was trailing white smoke. Coolant, maybe worse. Thach abandoned his own fight without a second's hesitation and dove to cover him, coming down on the lower Zero from behind. The range closed fast. He fired. The Zero came apart in midair. Engines overheating, heading back to the ship. "Go now." Bassett limped for the Yorktown with an escort, leaving Thach alone at 10,000 feet with 10 Zeros still circling, and no wingman left to weave with. 3 of them turned to finish the job. There was no partner left, no second aircraft to cross paths with. Every version of the tactic Thach had built assumed 2 planes. He had 1. Then something shifted in how he saw it. The weave had never really been about 2 aircraft. It was about refusing to give an enemy a straight line he could predict. He rolled hard right, then snapped the opposite direction almost immediately. Sharp, ugly, angular brakes. Nothing like the smooth turning fight a Zero pilot had trained his whole career to expect. The lead Zero committed to the right turn. Thach was already gone left. The Japanese pilot corrected, bleeding speed with every adjustment. Thach reversed again and again, forcing another correction each time. 40 seconds in, the Zero that should have owned this fight was matching Thach's altitude and speed exactly. No edge left to exploit. It broke off. The other 2 peeled away with it. Thach set down on the Yorktown 20 minutes later. Bassett was already aboard, his Wildcat riddled with holes, the engine somehow holding together on fumes. By morning, the story had already worked its way through the entire fleet. By June the 10th, Fighting Squadron 3 was running full weave formations as routine practice, official sign-off or not. 8 Wildcats met 14 Zeros escorting a convoy near Midway. Every pair held the pattern. Every time the Japanese tried isolating a single plane, that pilot simply flew back toward his partner, instead of trying to outturn the threat alone. 12 minutes later, the Zeros disengaged, having lost 3 of their own and downed nothing in return. The first time in the entire campaign that Wildcats had come out ahead in a major engagement. That got command's attention. Admiral Nimitz called Thach in personally, and within days an order went out fleet-wide. Every squadron in the Pacific would adopt the weave as standard practice, effective immediately. Paperwork moves at its own pace, though, and the enemy doesn't slow down to let you catch up. On July 7th, over Guadalcanal, 12 Wildcats from 6 squadrons ran into 32 Zeros. Only 4 of those pilots had trained on the weave. The rest hadn't had the chance yet. 22 minutes later, 6 Wildcats were gone. Every single loss belonged to a pilot who'd been fighting the old way, alone. The 4 who knew the weave flew home untouched and claimed 7 kills between them. That report settled the argument for good. Inside 2 weeks, every fighter pilot in the South Pacific had orders to learn it. No exceptions left standing. The numbers say more than any speech could. Before the weave, American fighters were downing fewer than 1 Zero for every 2 Wildcats they lost, a losing trade every time out. Within months of it becoming fleet-wide doctrine, that ratio had reversed, better than 2 Zeros down for every Wildcat lost. Losses that had run over 130 Wildcats in a 6-month stretch fell by more than 2/3 once the tactic took hold everywhere. Behind each of those figures sat a cockpit that never hit the water, and a letter that never had to get written. Thach spent much of the rest of the war training other pilots at a base back in San Diego. Hundreds of them, the same lesson, the same pair of matches. Nearly all of them carried it into combat afterward, and historians would later trace thousands of surviving aviators back to it. By 1945, a maneuver born from a box of matches had become the backbone of American fighter doctrine, and it didn't stay there. Korea, then Vietnam, at speeds Thach never personally flew. The underlying idea held: never fight alone, never fly a line the enemy can predict, always leave your wingman a shot. Years later, when people asked what had made him think of it, He never once called it genius. It wasn't genius, he'd say. It was desperation. I just wanted my boys to come home. He died in 2001, at 86. Naval aviators who'd flown 3 separate wars apart, Wildcats, Phantoms, Hornets, stood together at his funeral, each one alive, in some measure, because of a man who refused to accept that his pilots had to die the way the rulebook said they would. That maneuver is still taught to every American fighter pilot earning their wings today. Not as a history lesson, as doctrine that still holds up. If a story like this earned 5 minutes of your time, it costs 30 seconds to hit subscribe. There are 100 more like it sitting in the archives, waiting to get told. Drop a comment and let me know where you're watching from tonight. I read every one,